So I go on to talk about here how in Exodus 3:14 and 15, where they say the rabbis, the sages, to conceal God's name forever, that as we've seen in our text readings, the Hebrew text of Exodus 3:15 has God saying to Moses, now you will say to the sons of Israel, Jehovah, we'll talk about that pronunciation, has sent me to you. This is my name throughout antiquity, Le Olam, not Le Alem. And this is my memorial for generation after generation. This is my translation of the Masoretic text as represented in BHS 4th edition, in agreement and relevant part with Dead Sea Scroll text of Exodus 3:15, in 4Q Gen Exodus A 4Q13. So, now we have Greek fragments of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of this text, that go back far. But we don't have texts of Exodus 3:15 that go back further than pretty much the late 4th century, 5th century. And in those texts, of course, you have what? You have substitutions of the divine name. So once again, right, we just went from the Jews and their view of the rabbis and sages and the old man who spoke up and how they redefined Le Olam to Le Alem from to antiquity or forever or to time indefinite to conceal. Big difference, right? So we go from that. I'm not talking necessarily in strict timeline as far as when that happened, when the rabbis and sages began to reinterpret Exodus 3:15 and the substitution of the divine name with nomina sacra in texts like Exodus 3:15, in the Septuagint texts that are earliest in terms of that part of Exodus 3:15. So we have, at some point, the Christian scriptures of Exodus 3:15 and the Jewish interpretation of Exodus 3:15, both concealing the name. We have people like Philo, a Jew, a Greek Jew of the 1st century, and Justin Martyr, a Christian apologist of the 2nd century, both adopting a Platonic view of God where he does not have a name that's ascribable to him. Even though Philo does know, of course, about the biblical name for God, but he's following this Platonic view that overrides that. And I'm going to show that consistent with the Christian's view that God is not to be named at some point because of their substitution in their Septuagint texts and Christian scriptures, right? Copies we have of the New Testament that are different from the sources that were quoted when they were originally written, which we know, according to all evidence, contained a form of the divine name. It was later that was changed. Now, let me show you something that's similar to that. And, well, we'll get back to Philo and some of the things that he said in a moment. But let's move forward to a point where we can lay a little groundwork. So, I told you I would show you, in addition to how the rabbis and the sages taught to conceal God's name in Exodus 3:15 by changing the way Le Olam is pointed and understood, which they view as to conceal the name. And we know, based on the 1st century and pre-1st century Septuagint texts, that the divine name was used in those texts, like 4Q Leviticus B, we're going to get to in a moment. And that the other texts, the Hebrew Aramaic texts of the Old Testament, contain the divine name. So that, based on that evidence, we can say it's likely that Christian writers used the name. There's nothing in the New Testament that indicates any change with respect to their quoting of the name when they do. But then we get Philo in the 1st century talking in Platonic terms about God not being nameable. Then we get Justin Martyr doing the same thing in the 2nd century and following with other Christian writers. And then we get examples like this from Philo in his work on the change of names, I give the source here and a reference to the online edition. In his definition of the name Jesus, right, the Greek version of the Hebrew name Yehoshua or Yeshua, we'll go back to that in a minute. When Philo, in his On the Change of Names, defines Jesus, he defines it like this. Jesus means salvation of the Lord. This is the Greek transliteration. And it means Jesus means salvation of the Lord. But the definition of Jesus in a Jewish Christian, what we call an onomasticon, like a literary tool, or it contains definitions, explanations of names. When it defines Jesus, it's Jesus Yo Sotera. Jesus means Joe, like in Joel, Yo, El. There's a form of the divine name in some names that becomes, instead of Yah, Yo. We'll get to it a little bit further in a moment. And I talk about it more, of course, in my chapter 1 of my defended editions. But notice the difference. All right, we got Philo right here, 1st century Greek Jew, defining Jesus, which from the Hebrew form of the name Yehoshua, Yeshua, it gets shortened to Yeshua, means Jehovah is salvation, right? It includes a form of the divine name in the prefix. Here in Philo, it's substituted with Lord. But in the onomasticon, the proper definition is given, with the divine name separate from soteria and no use of Lord. Do you see that? So it's important you recognize that, because it's more than just the fact that the New Testament and the Septuagint have the nomina sacra for Lord and God and these divine terms, sacred abbreviations. It's more than that, and the comparison with the non-nomina sacra Old Testament text of the 1st century and preceding it. It's the view that God is not nameable, and that in their definition of names related to God, they're changing them from Yo, which is really another form of Yaho, to Kiryu, Lord, right there. That's an example of what we're talking about when we talk about conscious or actual substitution of the divine name with these terms.